Thanks very much for that, Shahid. Well, in the first session of today, we delve into a discussion about how tech and AI can help to expand pension access. We've heard of statistics globally that indicate that only a small minority of people manage to save enough to live comfortably and stress-free in their retirement years. Well, to give us her take on this particular issue, we have with us Uche Enemchukwu. She's the CEO of Nelu Diversified Solutions. She's highly experienced in this area and has made it her mission to look for solutions for people who have had a difficulty in being able to get their foot onto the pension fund landscape. Uche, thank you so much for joining us. It's over to you.
Awesome. Thank you, Nompu. Hi, everyone. So my name is Uche Enemchukwu. I am the CEO of Nelu Diversified Solutions. We are a global consultancy, global benefits consultancy, and we work with employers of all sizes in the US, the UK, and we are expanding our reach now. So to just give you a little bit of background, with respect to who I am. So let's see, I am a benefits attorney and strategy consultant, started off in big law, went to big consulting, Willis Towers Watson, now WTW. From there, went to Boeing to manage compliance for their retirement plans. And about 5 years ago, founded Nelu. The rest is history. It has been an amazing journey of really trying to change the benefits and retirement landscape globally, impact policy, and impact the way commercial and master trust, as well as employers, operate their schemes. So to give you an idea of the approach we take and what we think is incredibly critical for anyone who is any trustee who's running a commercial trust, master trust, or any trust, right, an employer trust, and any financial advisor, right, is to understand that copy and paste will not work, is to understand that at the end of the day, most people do not understand pensions, and as such, a really unique and intentional approach must be taken with different communities, with different member populations. So in short, with that background, what we like to think about is how do we make sure that we understand our member populations, right? And that doesn't mean simply understanding location. It means to truly understand who people are, what motivates them, and how to keep them engaged, right? So that requires actual hands-on-the-ground research and listening to understand first the social, environmental, and social cultural frameworks that impact their lives, right? Because the reality is, and we see this really everywhere, right, that socioeconomic inequality and inequities, social, environmental inequality and inequities impact access, right? So the first thing we want to really understand is who are we working with, right? So who are our members or our participants, we call them in the US? What are their challenges? How might these challenges present barriers to access, right? There's also really understanding the cultural norms, right, around retirement. To give you an example, I am Nigerian by background, so I've never seen retirement, right? My parents did not retire. Me and my 5 siblings are their retirement plan, okay? And I know so many of us and so many of your members and so many of the folks that you work with, this story is the same for them, right? So what does retirement actually look like and what does it mean, right? So in short, right, understanding is saving, in a retirement plan understood as an actual need, right? Is pensions understood as an actual need, right? How high or low is it on the list of priorities for folks, right? And that often is widely different just based on their experience and knowledge of pensions, obviously, right? And then just really thinking about, once we get people educated, once we get members educated, how can we support them to be able to actually use, contribute, and save enough to retire with dignity, right? So the research aspect of understanding what people need so that we can get them engaged, that aspect of our work is often seen as very academic. It's not academic, and I think it is academic, but we need to take it and we need to apply it, right, to the pension sector, right? And I think it's very much of a pity that historically, particularly with historically marginalized members, there has been a level of hubris, I guess you can say, where financial institutions and pensions have seen understanding members as an academic, kind of exercise, right? It's not. We need to use it when we think about things like public health, when we think about things like translational research. This is what they're doing, and this is how you reach people. So that is the approach that we take to make sure that we hone in on understanding who people are, understanding what's important to them, and making sure that we're then able to take the next step, which is examining either the pension scheme or the pension product that's being developed. And what that means is we take that information that we've gathered and we apply it to the scheme, or we apply it to the product to really understand, is there anything in this existing scheme, right, or in this existing product that's actually creating additional barriers for individuals, just based on what we know about the members, based on what we know about the folks who will be using this product, right? Is this actually creating additional barriers for them, access barriers, right? And so we want to remove those barriers, right? First step. Second step, how do we actually enhance and increase access, right? How do we formulate, how do we remove, for example, how do we remove scheme structure, right? Structures or design, that's the word I was looking for. How do we alter design to make sure that we are really addressing inequities and we're really opening the door for everyone to be able to participate? Same thing for products, right? How are we making sure that we are enhancing, right, the accessibility? So not just a certain group is able to benefit from it, but that everyone is, right? And when we're doing this examination, we're not only thinking about, how do we create more access, but we're also thinking about it from a business perspective. I run a business. I need to pay myself, I need to pay my expenses, and I need to pay my employees. You can do good while also making money. At the end of the day, when we take these additional steps to really understand who members are and to increase access, we are not only democratizing access to financial markets and to pensions and to pension products for our members, we're actually increasing profits across the board, right? Because now a product or a scheme is accessible to more people, and as such, more people are participating, right? So in short, that is the approach that we take, and I'm really excited to jump into this to really demonstrate exactly what I mean. So I'll hand it back over to you, Nompu.
Uche, thank you so much for that. I mean, the background that you've given us really gives us a sense of how passionate you are, first of all, in this arena. And the approach, is very refreshing, not to look at consumers or potential members as numbers, but as people, and actually finding out more about them, being able to better cater to their needs. So really fascinating. And so I'm looking forward as well to engaging with you, picking your brains on a number of issues in this arena. But let's just start with the basics. I mean, you've touched on it already, but why is it important to have a retirement plan? What's the use of having a retirement plan? Because you did refer to the fact that some people don't necessarily make that a priority.
Sure. So it's incredibly important to have a retirement plan because at the end of the day, we're all going to have to retire at some point, whether we want to or not. So if we expect to be able to continue to afford to live in a dignified manner, right, outside of poverty, the reality is we're going to need a retirement plan. I do want to add one additional point there, right? I don't like to think about a retirement plan in a vacuum, right? At the end of the day, it's about larger financial well-being before we retire and after we retire. And I want to underline that point, right? Because the way we talk about it matters so much to the way our members and our participants engage in these schemes. So I just wanted to make that clear. But retirement plans are incredibly important because we need them to survive at the end of the day.
Yeah. So to expand on that point then, what is the significance of sound financial advice when it comes to retirement planning? What are the sort of challenges and the risks that an advisor can give to a member or a potential member for them to make the right call?
Right. So at the end of the day, financial advice is opportunity, right? Financial advice is financial inclusion, right? Because at the end of the day, especially for those like me who have never seen a retirement plan or have never seen a parent retire, never seen a family member retire, and have never really experienced financial markets, we are missing out, right, on so many opportunities for financial well-being, not only in retirement, but now. So sound financial advice, ethical financial advice will set most folks up for being able to retire with dignity, being able to retire with enough to survive, and being able to not pass on that knowledge to others. So the reality is that sound financial advice not only creates opportunities for our members, but it also gives them the opportunity to fully engage in financial markets. And finally, it helps to prevent fraud. And I think particularly in emerging markets, really being aware of the reality of fraud is incredibly important. So having a strong financial advisor, having access to sound financial advice can be the difference between poverty and really being able to thrive in retirement.
Yeah. So it's no accident that I asked you the questions, what's the importance of having a retirement plan? And the importance of getting sound financial advice, because based on your introductory remarks, I wanted to ask you, what then are the realities as you see them from your research around the extent to which people are aware around, retirement plans and the importance of financial planning? What is the status quo right now as you see it?
Sure. People don't know. I'll put it like that. People don't know, especially in places like South Africa, emerging markets. The reality is that people don't know, right? Whether they're auto-enrolled or not, people don't know. What that means at the end of the day is that we can't talk about retirement plans in the language that we're using right now. The status quo is that most people, when you mention retirement or pensions, they're not able to pinpoint exactly what you're talking about in the first place. As such, the status quo is that people don't understand. And what I'm pushing and what we believe in is that what we need to do is speak about this differently so that people can get an introduction to what pensions are and start to understand. So to answer your question in short, the status quo, particularly in emerging markets, particularly in places where people have not had access to pensions in the past, the status quo is that they don't understand them at all, and that many who are actually auto-enrolled in these schemes don't even know that.
Yeah.
So it's a difficult position to be in.
So, Uche, let's get real here about the economic backdrop in emerging markets like South Africa that you've referred to. You have high levels of inequality. You have people who do work, but they earn only enough to actually get by. And then you've got, the uber rich, those who, have a lot of resources, and you've got this massive income gap. So even if you go out there and you speak to people and you try to educate them, the reality is that people have to decide whether they're going to buy food or electricity. Now, with that reality, how do you then assist people in that sort of situation to bridge the gap so that they're able to not only eat today, but tomorrow as well?
This is where education and financial advice are incredibly important, because it is very easy when you're not knowledgeable about how these plans or schemes work to immediately decide, right, that you can't afford it. And when we think about the socioeconomic inequalities in places like South Africa and other emerging markets, and these socioeconomic inequalities exist everywhere, exist in my market in the US, exist in the UK. The reality is, while we are trying to address, right, to the extent that we can through our pension schemes, through our pension products, to the extent that we can address those inequities, we need to, right, take a systems approach to address those inequities. And that's similar to what I talked about earlier in the introduction, right? That's looking at the structures, that's looking at the scheme design, that's looking at the product design to try to address those systemic barriers. But while we're doing that, the other piece of it is financial education. The other piece of it is financial advice. The other piece of it is financial guidance, right? Because we have to get people to understand, one, that they have a pension, right? They have access to a pension. And two, we have to get them, the sun is directly in my face. Two, we have to get them to understand, right, that at the end of the day, they can afford to contribute to a pension. And a huge part of that goes back to what you mentioned, what we talked about with respect to what is the importance of sound financial advice. The importance of sound financial advice is that we're taking the complexity from a tax perspective, from a how investments work perspective. We're taking that and we're reducing that complexity so that we get people to really see the big picture and really understand that it's something that is accessible to them and that they can afford to do.
So I wanted to ask you about an area that I know you're quite passionate about. We've talked about the challenges, we've talked about, the fact that people need financial education in the area of retirement planning. But how does tech and artificial intelligence, interface with this topic? We've heard that especially AI is a really good solution in many sectors, including the pension fund industry. Yeah. So perhaps you can just give us a sense of that, how it's now beginning to relate in your industry, what benefits it can bring.
Absolutely. So I want to talk about it in the context of South Africa, and I want to talk about it in the context of emerging markets, right? So the reality is that AI and tech allow us to leapfrog in the sense that we're able to meet people where they are, really regardless of their demographics, regardless of their income status, regardless of class, right? And especially in emerging markets where there is a lot of mobile access, right? So access to the internet. There is a lot of community kind of interaction, right? There are opportunities through technology and through AI to really get people up to speed, right? To some level, to some form, level the playing field, right? But with all of that said, I do think that there has to be special attention to the reality that technology and AI has to meet people where they are and has to do it inclusively and has to do it effectively. So that's where we are, and I look forward to talking about that a bit more.
Just give us a little bit more color around, the kind of product offering, the better product offering that can come through the provision or the utilization of AI, and also the issue around cost as well. And, you spoke earlier in your introductory remarks about meeting the customer where they are, which then is indicative of maybe being able to provide a bespoke product for an individual whose circumstances are different to the next person. Just give us a bit more refined information on this area.
Right. So when we think about, so I'll put it like this. A great example is MTN. So I hope that many of you are familiar with MTN. It's mobile money in short, right? So mobile money is something that over the last 20 years has become very effective in emerging markets, or has become highly utilized in emerging markets. And I recently heard a story about the development of mobile money in Ghana. It was really interesting because there was the realization that you couldn't copy and paste from one country to another, right? They had to get very specific to the specific needs, to the unique concerns, and to unique desires of the communities there, right? So it was really interesting because the expectation was that you could copy and paste from a neighboring country like Nigeria, right, to Ghana. That was not the case, right? So that meant that the development and the delivery of mobile money had to be done differently. So that means getting specific to the needs of individuals and being able to develop that product in such a way that it meets their specific needs and it fits into their cultural context.
Uche, you've been talking about emerging markets a fair bit. What trends are you seeing, in emerging markets when it comes to the utilization of artificial intelligence in the pension industry space? Is South Africa perhaps more sophisticated in this area than perhaps other countries?
So here's what I would say. The progression has been slow, as it should be, right? I am a huge proponent of AI, and I look forward to what it will be able to do, right? But the progression has been slow, and the progression has been slow for good reason. The reality is that AI still has some way to go in the pension space. And the reason it still has some way to go is because of our fiduciary responsibilities, right? So we know that AI still has some bias issues. We know that AI still hallucinates often, right? So the reality is that there's still more work that has to be done in the AI space, and that is really going to be the responsibility of schemes. That's really going to be the responsibility of vendors or product developers to make sure that they have fully prepared their technology, that they fully prepared the AI for the context and for the fiduciary responsibilities that they have to members. So I like to think about it like this, and it actually occurred to me last night because we had a thunderstorm. So lightning flashes, right? So we've had the flashpoint of AI, right? We've had that flashpoint. But the reality is sometimes you see the lightning and you're waiting for the thunder. So you're waiting, 10 seconds have passed, 15 seconds. And you realize that the lightning is actually further away than you thought it was. And that's the way I like to think about AI. It is here, it is a flashpoint. However, for those of us who have a fiduciary responsibility in the pension space, which we all do, and particularly in South Africa, where pensions regulations and financial regulations are quite robust, right, compared to the rest of Africa, are quite robust, there is time that needs to be taken to make sure that we are training the AI in such a way that we don't put ourselves, right, in that we don't get ourselves in trouble as fiduciaries, and that we don't mislead, misguide, or turn off, right, the communities that we're trying to get engaged in pensions.
Yeah. No, I hear what you're saying. I mean, it is a developmental story, not only for emerging markets, but also, I understand, for developed markets, because it's only now, you know, in recent years that they've begun to try and formulate policy and develop papers around this area of how to regulate, you know, the pension fund industry using, you know, supervisory technology and so on and so forth. So perhaps you can speak to that kind of thing, and also, you know, issues around cybersecurity, you know, the protection of people's information, especially given that AI, you know, you have the concept of generative AI, which can end up doing its own thing, ensuring that ultimately the product is fit for purpose for the consumer.
Right. So this actually goes back to my introduction, right? The important thing is to understand the communities that we are trying to reach and we're trying to get engaged, right? And not only the communities, all the stakeholders, right? So let's take South Africa, for example. Like I said, South Africa is from the perspective of regulations, right? From a regulatory perspective, is more advanced than other African nations, right? So the regulators, that's one major stakeholder that we have to pay attention to, right? The second piece of that are the actual pension members, or those who are trying to get engaged or enrolled in pensions, right? The other stakeholders. The other piece of it are the vendors and the different service providers that are going to be involved in getting technology out, right? At the end of the day, we have to address each of those stakeholders. So we have to address the regulatory aspects of it, right? So what that means is that when we're thinking about AI, when we're thinking about technology, when we're racing forward, right, we have to think about that context, that specific context, the regulatory context of that location, right? Then we also have to think about who are the members, who are the individuals, right, that we are marketing these products to, who are the individuals that we're trying to reach, who are the individuals that we're trying to guide, right, with the ultimate goal of getting them hopefully in-person financial advice, right? And then finally, who are the service providers who are going to be able to do this, right? What will the support structure look like, right? So that means from a service provider perspective, from a financial advisor perspective, when you've used the technology to guide someone in a certain way to get them engaged, what does the end result look like, right? What is the outcome that we're looking for? And a lot of that will really rely on the person that they end up talking to, the person that really gets them right to the next step in terms of the opportunity to really engage and benefit from a pension scheme or from a pension product, right? So that means we have to diversify our service providers. That means we have to diversify the folks who they will be face-to-face with. Because at the end of the day, if we get people to that step, right, we get people to that step where they are fully engaged in the pension product and the technology, and therefore, right, we want them in the pension in the scheme, right? At the end of the day, we don't want to end up turning them away because they finally get fully engaged, finally start talking to folks, and they find out that the technology may have understood them, but the people, right, who they need to really explain how it works, the people who they need to advise them long term don't actually understand them. So when we're thinking about the outcomes, when we're thinking about technology and AI, we have to think about the outcome, right? So we can work with all the stakeholders and get where we need to get to, right? With the regulators, with building the actual technology and getting the service providers in place. But our focus from a pensions perspective, our fiduciary responsibility from a pensions perspective is on the member, right? So we build this around the member, and that means that our focus needs to be on the outcome for the member. So all the stakeholders have to be aligned in order to achieve the outcomes that we talked about earlier, which is financial well-being in general, but also dignity in retirement, right? Not retiring in poverty.
Yeah. You know, just to touch on what you've just spoken about, which I thought was very interesting, is getting that balance right between human service, human capital service to a member or a potential member, and the use of AI as an example. So if, say, for example, there's some sort of mistake or error, you know, that is made in the delivery of the financial advice or retirement planning advice, and you're relying heavily on AI, you know, who can the member or potential member then blame if things go wrong?
So at the end of the day, when we are talking about fiduciaries, right, whether that is a financial advisor, whether that is a trustee for the pension scheme, you can't delegate. You can delegate. You can delegate actions, right? You can delegate administration, right? You can delegate delivery, but you cannot delegate your fiduciary duties, right? So what that means is that if the technology or if the AI has a hiccup, if the technology or the AI communicates incorrectly, which is one of our fiduciary duties, right? Then that is a breach on the part of the fiduciary, right? So that is a breach on the part of the pension scheme. That is a breach on the part of the financial advisor. So that is why I was saying earlier, right, that we have seen the flashpoint, we've seen the lightning, right? But we still need some time in the pension space, right? We still need some time in the pension space to get the technology and get to the AI right, so that we don't create a situation where we end up breaching our fiduciary duties and we also end up putting our members in a worse position, or even worse, turning them away from prioritizing pensions because of the impact of our really lack of care with respect to the technology and the AI.
Yeah. So, Uche, I get it from our conversation that you really are about putting the member first, putting the consumer first. That comes through very strongly. And I wanted to ask you, just from your own personal experience and having told us what your approach has been to getting people to buy into the whole retirement plan story, what sort of impact has that had? I mean, what sort of behavioral changes have you seen from the kind of work that you've been doing in communities, both in the UK and in the United States?
It's important for people to feel like they matter. And particularly when we're talking about something like financial inclusion, when we're talking about pensions, when we're talking about democratizing access to financial markets, there have been people who have been left out, particularly in emerging markets. But if we're talking about the US and the UK, just historically, there are people who have been left out, meaning that they haven't had access to financial institutions or actually barred from financial institutions, right? So they never mattered in that context, right? And now we're trying to remind people that they matter, meaning this is for you as well. It is very easy, right, to see something that is clearly not speaking to you, is clearly not speaking to your situation, and decide that it's not for you. And to just give you a quick example, when I was a plan sponsor, right, or a scheme sponsor at an employer, the scheme that we had available, we had a service provider who essentially put together communications, right, for our members. And the communications spoke about saving for a retirement home, right? So for most of our members, that doesn't apply to them. For most of our members, they were working on paying off debt, paying off student loans, paying off all other types of debt, right? So to send them a communication like that essentially said to them that this isn't for you. This scheme is not for you, right? These financial well-being programs are not for you, right? So at the end of the day, focusing on the members, understanding exactly who they are is so important to make them understand that, one, they matter, and particularly in a space as sensitive as financial well-being, particularly in a space that has excluded them in the past, they matter and as such should be fully engaged. And so that's on us, right? Whether we're in the West, whether we're in emerging markets, that's on us as retirement professionals, as fiduciaries, to understand who people are, make sure that they know that they matter in order to get them fully engaged.
Uche, you know, one of the things that's very topical is the issue of gender savings. You know, men and women's lives, you know, historically have moved in different directions. So I wanted you to speak to the issue of gender savings disparity, what your observations are in that regard, women earning lesser pay in places of employment relative to their male counterparts, and so on.
So the gender savings gap is very real everywhere. And I think it's more pronounced in certain emerging markets, mainly because of, you know, the cultural impacts, right? Or the sociocultural environment, I'll say that, right? So what that means is it goes back to what I talked about in my intro. It goes back to speaking to people the way that we need to speak to them and understanding the systemic and socio-environmental frameworks that impact their ability to save, right? So for women, like you mentioned, there have been historically and still are today so many systemic barriers that reduce access not only to having a pension in the first place, but reduce access to be able to save as much as necessary, to save as much as men are able to save in their pensions, right? So that means when we're looking at pension design, that means when we are looking at pension products, that means when we're thinking about technology and AI, we have to, right? We have to take into account the reality of the systemic issues, right? So that means that we have to not only design in a certain way when we want women to be fully included, that means we also have to communicate in a certain way. Because in many cultures, including my own, and this is globally, right? So whether it's emerging markets, whether we're talking about the West, the reality is it's not only that women, you know, have had more breaks, you know, in the workplace, from the workplace. It's not only that women have historically made less than men, the pay gap, right? It's not only that that women have also been part-time more than men, mainly because they're handling, you know, household responsibilities. It's also that women haven't received the same kind of educational access, the same kind of guidance that a lot of men have received, mainly because in, you know, in marriages, right, and in relationships and partnerships, men tend to handle the finances. So we have to take that very hard data, right, that reality, the hard data around the pay gap and women spending more time outside of the workplace, and we have to take the sociocultural, right, reality that women are less likely to handle the finances in the home and are more likely in a divorce or in some form of split. They're more likely to end up, retiring in poverty because they have a smaller pension pot. We have to take those realities and we have to design our pension schemes. We have to design our pension products, and we have to make sure our AI is aware of those things in order to be able to speak to women, in order to get them systemically and personally, right, able to catch up with their male counterparts. So I think there's a lot of opportunity here, right, for pension scheme trustees around design, for financial advisors around making sure that they're speaking to women in the way that they need to be spoken to, taking into consideration the systemic impacts, historical systemic impacts, taking into consideration that they're less likely to have the financial knowledge that maybe a spouse or a partner may have. A male spouse or a male partner may have, and also taking into consideration that data makes it very clear that women and other minorities prefer to speak to people who have the same backgrounds, right? So if we are hiring service providers, if we are financial advisors ourselves, and we're not diverse, right, we are doing women a disservice, right? Because they're more likely to engage with someone who understands the systemic impacts, who understands their experience with money, and so that they don't have to start to explain all the reasons that they might not be as financially well as they should be, right? So avoiding shame, avoiding really just having to explain things that they shouldn't have to.
Yeah. It's interesting, the perspective that you're coming from, talking about maybe, rejigging the product design of pension products, etc. But what would you, as an advisor, as a retirement fund planner, be advising women who are in the circumstances that you've outlined? Maybe they're part-timers, they've taken a few years off work due to maternity leave and so on and so forth. What advice do you give them about how, with the limited resources they have, they actually ensure that they are putting away? Because you can have all this fancy design in terms of products, but you need somebody to be putting in.
That is absolutely right. So I advise trustees and I advise employers. So I'm going to speak to both, right? So advising trustees and employers, and then the other one is advising, like you said, women, right? Female members or female individuals who have access to pensions, right, and could be enrolled. So here's what I will say. I think in the pension space, I think it's very easy to forget that the way that we design our pension schemes and the way that we design our pension products can make a huge difference, right? So what I'm talking about specifically is when we look at matching contributions. So we call them matching contributions here in the US and in the UK. When we look at matching contributions, when we look at profit sharing contributions, all the different types of contributions that employers can make for their participants or their members, when we look at how those are structured, it is always, in my experience, very possible to restructure those employer contributions. That's what they are. It's very possible to restructure those contributions in a way that addresses issues that impact women, like time out of work, for example, years of service, for example, continuous years of service, etc. Because at the end of the day, when we have design and structures within schemes that are based on years of service, women have less years of service. So you've already created an inequity there, right? So when we look at the pension scheme design, there are different things that we can do within the design that, like I said earlier in my intro, to make sure that we're not creating additional barriers for people who may already be experiencing disparities, right? So that's what I'm talking about on the pension scheme side. So now when we talk about women, right, say I'm a financial advisor speaking to women, right? The reality at the end of the day is that I would want a woman speaking to another woman, right? And I said this before, it's incredibly important when we're talking about something as sensitive as finances, the same thing with health. When we're talking about something as sensitive as finances, we want someone who the individual can trust, right? And I'm not saying that's the rule across the board, but in general, that's what you want. Someone that the individual can trust and they can feel comfortable speaking to. And here's why, right? Because we want people to feel comfortable, right? Completely being transparent about their financial situation, right? So what I would advise a woman, right, who has questions about her pension or has questions about, her finances in general, I would advise that person to be very transparent, because you can't get the advice that you need without being transparent. I would advise them to be transparent and to have some level, to pick a financial advisor that they trust so that they can be transparent. Because if they're not transparent, that financial advisor will not be able to get them fully where they need to be, right? To give them the opportunity to really catch up in a way that makes sense, right? Yeah. In a way that reduces the disparity.
So, Uche, when it comes to emerging markets, we know that there's still a long way to go in terms of pension access. There's difficulties with having enough resources to get on board, financial education, et cetera, et cetera. But what is it that you think that these kind of societies could be doing better to get to that point where we're seeing a bit more of universal access to pensions?
So bringing it back to the South African context, South Africa has done a great job of giving people who otherwise would not have access to pensions, right? And I think South Africa has also been very thoughtful about the reality that systemic inequalities have created issues where people may not feel like they're able to afford to save. Whether that's real or perceived, because I believe that everyone can afford to save, given the benefits of a retirement plan, which I won't get into today from a tax perspective, et cetera. But I think South Africa has done a good job of understanding that those socioeconomic inequalities and inequities have created situations where people feel that they're not able to afford to save. And as such, people feel that if they do save, their money is then locked up in the pension. And if they have an emergency, right, their money is locked up and they're not able to access it. So having the dual pot system gives people kind of a sense of, okay, I'm not stuck. I can save, but if I have an emergency, I'm able to access this, right? So that reality, I think, is a learning, I would say, for other emerging markets. And I think also, I would say, a learning for Western nations as well, understanding that inequality is very real, right? And emergencies happen, right? And some people are not able to respond to emergencies the way others are. So in short, to wrap up my answer, I would say broadly in emerging markets, there are opportunities to get these informal markets into some form of, whether it's a pooled pension or an individual pension, some form of retirement savings. There are opportunities there that I think can follow a lot of the mobile finance approaches that have worked so far. And then in South Africa in particular, really continuing to pull people into these formal pension schemes and then getting them engaged, right? So that they're actually contributing as much as possible, and so that they're also engaging in financial advice to improve their financial well-being lifelong, whether before and after retirement.
Well, I don't think you could have said that any better. Thank you so much, Uche, for your insights on this very interesting area. I've been in conversation with Uche Enemchukwu. She's the founder and CEO of Nelu Diversified Solutions. We're going to take a quick break.